Earlier this week, there was a joint action between the U.S. Treasury Department and the Department of Justice, taking down a pig butchering scam ring. I don't even know the best way to define what exactly was going on over there, but yeah, we're going to dig into that. There was a bunch of Bitcoin that was seized as part of that, some strategic Bitcoin reserve implications. But Stephen, why don't you kick us off here? What kind of went down earlier this week, and why is it maybe symbolically important?
Sure. Well, there's sort of three parts to that answer, and I'll try to hit one or two of them, and then Zach, uh, Shapiro, I want you to clean up. But there's sort of the scheme, the pig butchering scheme. What is that? I think some people know, some people don't. It's bigger than anyone thinks. Obviously, after this, you're like, whoa! I think everyone's like, wait, that's a lot. That's a lot of money that was seized. That's a lot of Bitcoin that was seized. So there's the scheme, there's the seizure, and then there's sort of how is this involved with the strategic Bitcoin reserve or other policy positions or policies that are either that exist or that are being worked on currently. The scheme, though, my father was a butcher growing up, so I'm really familiar with the concept. You fatten up a pig before you slaughter it, and that's exactly what these scammers do. Is they extract maximum value from their target. And so it starts as maybe a simple type of social engineering type scheme where they find people, and the sort of the worst part about this, from what I've seen, is like the people who end up falling for it they self-select based on something going on in their life. Maybe they're emotionally vulnerable, just went through a divorce, or maybe they're nearing retirement and they don't have enough money to retire. There's something going on psychologically or emotionally with a lot of them. They may be elderly people, but they're already vulnerable. And the more vulnerable you are, the more value can be extracted from you. So it's horrible. Some of them end up, some people have actually ended up committing suicide because of this. Maybe it's $5,000, maybe it's $5 million that they lose, but whatever it is, the way these scammers work is they extract the most they can. And so if you lose 5,000 to a scheme, that may have been like your life savings. There's been instances of individuals taking out, mortgages or second mortgages on their homes, and you're like, well, that's crazy. I would never fall for that. Well, I've seen uh, instances of like people who know better, right? But they're in a weird stage of life. Maybe they work in cyber, but they still fall for it, and they take out second, third mortgages, mortgages on their homes, their vacation homes. They go get loans to put more money in because the way the scheme works and the scam, it's maybe it's not, maybe this is a scam, or maybe this is weird. It's sort of suggested by someone they've fallen in love with online, right? Hey, I'm making some money, here on the side. I'm getting 20% returns. And then it works. They actually do make money off. Oh yeah, I got a check from that. Oh, okay, yeah, I did, or a check. I got the yield. And so, wow, I'm going to put a little more in to get a little more yield, and then I'm going to put a little more in, and that's how it ends up working. So it's nasty. It's a nasty business. It's not this sort of innocuous thing, which for a long time I thought, and I think a number of people did, like, okay, people kind of call you, they scam you. No, it's way more. It's nastier than that. A lot of it's based in Southeast Asia, which I saw. The seizure, of course, was. There's been reports of like 30-page detailed slide decks instructing the scammers exactly when tactically to do certain things and when to make the initial ask and when to up the ante. It's a very sophisticated scheme. So that's the one side of it is, and I think it's important to understand is just how devastating it is. And because of that, it's embarrassing. And so people don't like to report it because they're ashamed. And so anyway, it's really brutal. And so we've seen recently this massive seizure, one of the largest, if not the largest, seizure in history of Bitcoin. And the DOJ carries this out. They bring all of this Bitcoin in domestically. And this is where we begin to see sort of how current policy environment plays out and interacts with this seizure of Bitcoin. I'm going to kick that back over to you, Cohen, at this point, and then I think Zach and Ken have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, yeah, Zach, let's pick up there. You know, I think a lot of people were like, "Oh, I'm not gonna feel excited about the strategic Bitcoin reserve until the United States starts buying Bitcoin." That's something we've heard a lot. Um, there are definitely other people who are saying, well, all the Bitcoin needs to be returned to the rightful owners. So there's some angles here for you to unpack. Let's get into that.
Yeah, for sure. And there have been, I think, some confused responses to this in the Twitterverse, and so a couple things to unpack. First, I want to underscore some of what Stephen said about how bad this is, and let's talk a little bit about who got their funds seized. So there are sort of three things that are unique about this pig butchering scheme, including the ring that was busted. First, it is just a massive, massive operation. I mean, you can tell by the amount of Bitcoin that was seized, but this is one of the few fraud attempts that I can be pretty confident saying that everyone listening to this will have been targeted for, maybe as much as like once or twice a day. The way these schemes start is you get a text message or a voicemail from a wrong number. And it's like obviously a wrong number. It's like, hey, I hope you had a good time at Sally's party last weekend, or, why haven't you called me, or whatever. And most people will ignore that. And some number of people will say, oh, sorry, wrong number. And then the person on the other end will try to strike up either a friendship or a romantic relationship, depending on which version of the scam it is. And some small percentage, but when you talk about hundreds of millions of people, a large number of people will continue that relationship. So it's incredibly broad in terms of how many people are targeted. Second, the name pig butchering, as Stephen mentioned, it's about sort of fattening up your target before you go in and slaughter it. So unlike sort of the traditional sort of Nigerian prince scams or traditional sort of crypto based social engineering where they're trying to get like a specific amount from your Coinbase account, or they're getting you to pay them a certain amount, they really want to sort of feel out how much they can get from you. So we talked, I think, on this podcast months back when Google did a purge of fake crypto trading apps from its Google Play Store. This was all part of pig butchering schemes. So once you strike up a relationship with these people, they'll generally tell you they're making a huge amount of money doing this, delta neutral trading, blah, 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 blah. They'll show you the exchange. They'll first tell you how much money they're making long before they invite you to join them. And then, months down the line, they'll say, I can get you into this, send me a bunch of Tether, send me a bunch of Bitcoin, and it'll look like you're making money. They might even give you some back. But then at the end, when you're ready to take profits, they'll say, actually, we need you to pay this tax to get it off the exchange and to see if you pay the tax. But then it ends with you getting rug pulled for the entire amount. So they really try and take as much from people as possible. And I think with the number of people scammed, it's still like it's like, if you're looking at Bitcoin per victim here, we're looking at tens of millions of Satoshis at least per victim. So these people are taken for large amounts of money. I can echo what Stephen said. In my law practice, I have people come to me, unfortunately, all the time who have been targets of these things. And, an example that sticks out is a person who worked as a financial professional on Wall Street his whole life and got taken for like $5.5 million in one of these. So it is not just sort of the most naive, dumb people. There are all sorts of people. The third sort of uniquely pernicious thing, and the reason why we should not at all sort of identify with the bad guys here or be confused about whether it's good to freeze their assets. The people who are doing these schemes are basically, they're slaves. They've been human trafficked. Oftentimes Chinese nationals who are taken to a place in Cambodia or Southeast Asia, and they are just made to do this day in and day out to defraud Americans and other Westerners. So, definitely great to have taken down this particular ring. I think a lot of work in this particular investigation was done in the previous administration, but the seizure was made more recently of these coins. So this is, I think, needless to say, not the same thing as the United States government coming after Bitcoiners because they're Bitcoiners. This is a really enormous, really sophisticated, and frankly, really evil criminal operation whose Bitcoin was taken. Second, these are not, the question of like, do the funds go back to victims or do the funds go to the government? That is a legal question. Now, in almost all cases where someone has been defrauded, there is an opportunity for them to get restitution. Sometimes a judge overseeing a case like this will order a specific restitution plan to find victims. Sometimes victims can reach out and say, hey, I lost this amount of money. Here's my proof. And then they can make a claim as to funds that were seized. In any event, under the terms of the executive order that established the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, in order for the government to get Bitcoin for the strategic reserve from a seizure like this, there must have been a final forfeiture order where they are not infringing on the property rights of any victims. That's in the executive order. No judge is going to allow that. And so any of this Bitcoin that ends up in the strategic reserve is not going to come at the expense of victims, nor should it. These are completely separate processes, and none of this Bitcoin is going to end up in the SBR until there's been a final court order sort of net of what was taken from victims. As a side note, a lot of the victims probably paid Tether and not Bitcoin. And so it may well be that a lot of restitution claims will be paid out in dollars, but because of the SBR order, we're just not going to sell the Bitcoin. And so this ends up being essentially, because the government is going to pay out the victims, this becomes functionally a way for the U.S. government to buy Bitcoin, because they're going to pay out the claims in dollars anyway. And
Zach,
then finally,
real fast before you hit the last point. So the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Act, an executive order, has nothing to do with whether or not victims get their money or not. That process is separate. And it also has nothing to do with whether the DOJ decides to go in and seize assets or conduct criminal, anti-criminal operations abroad or whatever. Like, those are all like, hey, should we go after bad guys? Yes or no? Okay, we did. Should the people who were stolen from, are we going to be able to give them their money back? Yes or no? We make these decisions, and then the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve kind of comes into play if things go a certain way, right?
100%. And I guess another way of putting that is, what the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is not an alternative to the victims getting back Bitcoin that might have been stolen from them. The Strategic Reserve is an alternative to the U.S. Marshal Service, which are the sort of police for the court system, auctioning off those Bitcoin into the market. And so, okay, probably a lot of Bitcoiners here, if the Marshal Service was going to dump 127,000 coins into the market at once, we'd love, if Bitcoin went to 47K or whatever that massive market sell would temporarily do. But in terms of like investor confidence in Bitcoin, in terms of like the government getting the most value out of Bitcoin that ends up on the government's balance sheet anyway, it's hard for me to see this anything other than like a clear win.
Great. Ken, anything you want to add before we jump to the next topic here?
Yeah, I think there's an important policy context here that I deal with all the time on Capitol Hill, for example, because the proceeds were in Bitcoins. All of a sudden, this is a Bitcoin problem, and it's part of the whole Bitcoins for Criminals FUD. Pig butchering, just like North Koreans and Lazarus, like ransomware. There's a nation state aspect to this whole question. This was a whole network of Chinese nationals occupying village-sized complexes with hundreds of people. Try going in Cambodia. Try going to Cambodia and sending a text or a tweet about Falun Gong, and you'll find out that the arm of Beijing's arm has long reach. So I think the first part is to recognize that the pig butchering question, like these other things I mentioned, are fundamentally in terms of the percentage of what matters, nation state problems. The Cambodian government could shut down pig butchering operations in Cambodia tomorrow if they chose to. The Chinese government could stop their nationals from building these organizations, building these networks and exploiting American victims if they wanted to. The fact is they don't. The same goes for North Koreans, where they cash out their stolen crypto, and ransomware actors in Russia. There was always a nation state aspect to this, and I think that's important. That's an important distinction to make, because again, the anti-Bitcoin crowd likes to talk about how this is Bitcoin crime. It's not. I mean, Bitcoin is used as part of it because they stole it, but fundamentally, it's a nation state problem. Secondly, on the whole, again, to emphasize, these victims are not cracking open their cold cards and sending Bitcoin to scammers out of cold storage. They're going to Bitcoin ATMs. They're using Coinbase. They're using every exchange in the country to do this, right? So there are better ways for us to combat pig butchering than to somehow require Americans to KYC on their wallets, for example. Most crypto crimes, certainly pig butchering, and certainly the other two I mentioned, are fundamentally nation state problems. They will not, they simply won't be solved by some of the ideas you get coming from the sort of the Elizabeth Warrens of the world. Even maybe some of the ideas that you saw floated in the leaked, but I think now passe, but the leaked statement from Democrat senators about how to fight crime and you know and all of the tropes, right? Counterterrorism, that kind of thing. So I think it's important, and it's important to recognize that because it's a terrible headline, right? $15 billion in Bitcoin stolen from American senior citizens, or in this case, his ex-friend. But the fact is, you know, these organizations are allowed to function because nation states allow them to do that. If nation states cease to allow them to do that, the problem wouldn't go away. I mean, there's still ones off, but at the end of the day, it would not be the story that it is today if certain nation states didn't allow it to happen.